and thank you very much for joining us in the salon. I say good evening because we're in the UK and it feels like even it's 8 p.m. and it's dark outside. Who not enjoying these dark nights already? I'm Adam Smith. I'm the Program Director for Dementia Researcher, and I'm delighted to be hosting this evening's salon session, which is all about unconscious bias. As you probably know, in our weekly salons, we talk about research and careers topics to get some new perspectives and to educate and entertain and hopefully get some new ideas and hear your ideas too. We start with 30 to 40 minutes of in the live stream with the talks from two brilliant speakers. And then we have a little discussion amongst ourselves. And then the remainder of the time is spent joining you in the discussion space in the online chat to hear your perspectives on this topic, but also to give you a chance to ask questions for our speakers. I'm just gonna clarify briefly, because last week somebody left the session and then sent me a message saying, where do I join the chat? So I just want to make clear, the chat don't go anywhere. So when the live bit ends and we turn our cameras and microphones off and there'll be this background video playing with music, stay where you are. And if you're watching on a website, in the very bottom right-hand corner of your screen is a little chat button. Press that chat button, and that's where we'll have the discussion. And if you are watching this on your phone, I think you can do the same. I think the link is at the top, though. And if you're watching this on recorded, that just because you weren't able to make it live today doesn't mean you can't still join the discussion. If you post comments against the recording, our speakers can still see that. You can tag them if you put @ and then Daniel or Michael or myself. We'll get notifications and we can reply to your questions if you're watching later.
Yeah. Adam, if the people joining could go into their chat now, because a little window comes up alongside your main window in preparation, because I will have a question for you and it will require an instant response. It's part of the plan. So just have your chat ready to go. Good planning. And I'm told that the people who make our platform, the good people at Circle, have got the facility coming up soon for us to be able to build polls in there. So I'm looking out for that new functionality. But hey, nice. Thanks very much for joining us, everybody. I'm going to get on with some introductions. Our two speakers this evening are Professor Michael Coleman and Dr. Daniel Ruiz-Gabarre. I didn't check with your pronunciation of your name before, so I apologize if I got that wrong. Hi, both of you. Thank you very much for joining. And I'm sorry I'm not wearing my t-shirt. I've just got back from an awesome Race Against Dementia annual forum meeting, which was brilliant. Big up to Race Against Dementia, and thank you for having me for that. Michael is the Van Geest Professor of Neuroscience in the Department of Clinical Neuroscience at the University of Cambridge. Michael leads a team that comprises of exceptional researchers from around the world, and his research sits at the interface between basic and clinical neuroscience, translating advances in axon and synapses protection to treat and prevent neurodegenerative diseases. He also turned his hand to blogging this year and has published an incredible blog series. And I'm sure I remember you seeing Trailing Series 2 is on its way. Which is coming September the 23rd.
Science Without Anguish, so do go check those out. Although, Michael, you need to narrate them as well. Did you do the narrations? You did.
I haven't yet, but it's a very good idea. It's on my to-do list.
The narrations are good. Lots of people enjoy our blog narrations because they're little bite size. You can do it while you're walking the dog. But that's Professor Coleman, and Daniel is a postdoc at the University of Edinburgh within the UK Dementia Research Institute. His interests range widely from molecular biology and neurodegeneration to sociolinguistics and science communications. Dan is also, I believe, proud to introduce himself as a gay pharmacist neuroscientist, and he's a member of PRISMA, the Spanish Association for Defending Gender and Sexual and Effective Diversity in STEM and Innovation, and has contributed to the creation of the Equalities Committee that they have as well. Is that that's right to say, Daniel? Does that?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, that's perfect.
Thank you so much for both of you joining me this evening. Let me set the scene quickly. And this is a new topic for me. I'm really fascinated to hear. Our speakers don't get much by way of a briefing from me. It's very open to say you can interpret this topic as you like, but this is a new one for me as well. So I'm really fascinated to hear, because there's so many different elements to consider when you explore unconscious bias. So unconscious bias lurks silently in the corridors of our minds, apparently, subtly influencing our perceptions, decisions, interactions, and probably, potentially, our research without our conscious awareness. It shapes our views and can inadvertently lead to discriminatory practices in virtually all aspects of society, from hiring processes to how we deliver healthcare, how we even deliver research and a study. Recognizing and addressing these biases is crucial, as they can perpetuate inequalities and hinder diversity. So how can unconscious bias manifest itself in research? Is it a problem? How do you address it? And do you even realize it's happening? Are some of the things we're going to explore this evening. And I believe Michael is going to speak first to this topic. So that's enough from me. I'm going to shut up now, turn my camera and microphone off, and hand over to you, Michael. Thank you.
Yes. So can you hear me okay?
We can.
Yep. Yeah, so first of all, I just want to congratulate Adam on starting this marvelous initiative. I think it's a really, really important initiative, and glad I can contribute. And the second thing I need to do is to acknowledge, address the elephant in the room. As a white male, I recognize in many ways any influence of unconscious bias is a little bit the wind behind me in many ways, but also as a first generation student and everything beyond being a student with a northern accent and coming from definitely not a middle class background, there's other ways in which I'm also finding my way through the system. So that's cards on the table. But what I do is take a great deal of interest in psychology and how that plays out in research life, and as Daniel will expand on, in the research itself. So I expect everyone has done the unconscious bias test. I think it's obligatory in most institutions today. So you probably know a little bit about this area. But here are two things which you may not yet know, which really sum up a key part of the message I will make here tonight. The first is the correct name is not unconscious bias, it's the implicit association test. And that's important, I think, because bias seems to carry with it an element of judgment. And that is one of the key messages I would say. We should take judgment out of the whole thing. It's extremely important that we do that because that actually blocks people from actually recognizing it in themselves. And I think it's a crucial point. It generates a reaction, oh, but not me. But as you'll see in a few minutes, it's much more widespread. And that's the other key point, really, that the prevalence of this implicit association is essentially 100%. Now, there might be some nuances on which topics and in which direction people may have that implicit association, but everybody has it in some way, and I'll talk in a few minutes about where that comes from and what its consequences are. But one of the best demonstrations of that is from the researcher in the US who first developed the implicit association test and has publicized it a great deal, Mahzarin Banerjee. She is an immigrant, a first-generation immigrant from India to the US, and she was given, when she was, I think, a student or a postdoc, a forerunner of the test by her supervisor, and shocked to the core to find out that she herself was showing a positive score for association with certain characteristics. And having been almost undoubtedly very noticeably on the receiving end of a certain amount of bias, she may have felt very concerned about that. But this is a good demonstration that we all have it. And I'd be the first to acknowledge that I also have that. And I'm going to put in the chat right now a number of links. The first one of which is an extremely good podcast article from the Hidden Brain podcast series, actually 2 articles, 2 successive interviews with that researcher, Mahzarin Banaji. So key message then, take the judgment out of it and recognize that everyone has this implicit association characteristics. So how about you? So let's imagine this scenario. You're walking home late at night along a dark and lonely road. Doesn't matter if you're male or female. A dark and lonely road is dangerous to everyone to different extents, or has potential danger and threat. As you're starting off, 2 strangers, complete strangers, offer to walk with you. One is male, one is female. You can only walk with one of them. Who do you feel safer with? Put your answers in the chat in the next 2 seconds. So the only correct answer to that question is you don't have enough information. But many people would say, and I also would instinctively say female, probably for reasons that females, the associations females are somewhat kinder, and also the physical strength is on average, and this is an objective factor, that on average a female physical strength will be lower and therefore less of a direct threat. But there's critical information we do not know. We don't know the character of that individual, and the physical strength may be a fact, but if that individual has it, of course, there's all variation. But there's no way of knowing whether that physical strength will be used at all. Most likely not in any way. But if it was used, would it be used against you or potentially in your defense? In which case, it makes all the difference. So the bottom line is there's not enough information. But even anyone who instinctively thinks that correct answer, there's not enough information, almost always will first think, female, and then think, yeah, but hang on a minute. So the crucial thing is that thought comes later. And this plays out in so many other ways, and we'll see in a moment how it also plays out in the workplace. So it's important to recognize how deep this is and where it comes from, because sometimes we can get the impression that it only begins when we're in the workplace, when we're in a university or in an academic lab, and that is definitely not the case. Consider a newborn baby. The very first experience that baby has, in the vast majority of cases, is to be put with the mother, and from that person they get comfort and food and good things. A little bit later, they may be introduced to dad, and they realize they can get these things from him too, but in some ways never quite the same, especially food, of course, and quite often availability, because even in these days of shared parental leave, it's quite often the mother first and then father. And so the message is right from the very beginning that you get different things from each gender. Move a little bit further, that baby starts to grow up a bit, starts to recognize colors, start to understand. They look at skin color. The vast majority of babies, again, not everybody, but the vast majority will see someone with the same colored skin as themselves. And that starts to introduce into their mind that they're developing circuits as they're learning a very powerful message of that color means security. And that is a message that's incredibly hard to overcome later in life in any way. Move on to school days. So my school days, things have changed a little bit now. My school days, there was only one black child in the class, and everyone else was white. Up until I think the age of 12, that was the only non-white person I had any regular association with. All of our teachers were female. That actually, I would say, has become even more skewed. My kids, as they've gone through the school system, have had even a bigger preponderance of female teachers, even through secondary school, and quite a large majority even at sixth form college. And studies have shown, using the implicit association test, that 5 to 6 year old children have an implicit association in gender, race, and other areas every bit as strong as any adults. The one difference is they are more open about it. They don't feel any concern about showing it and saying it. But it's there. It's there already at the age 5 to 6. No amount of later learning will turn that around when someone comes in to start a PhD at 22, 23, 24 years old. It's already very powerfully wired in our brains. All we can do, and that we must do, is build something else on top. Now, most of us, I hope the vast majority of us, have done this. But while we can control our words and our decisions, it's much harder to control our body language. How many of us can truly say, when we meet someone of a different skin color, we know that the right thing to do and the way we actually want to act is to treat them absolutely equally? But how many of us can say we look them in the eye and we smile to exactly the same extent as we would with somebody more like ourselves, or someone who's disabled, or somebody who's considerably older than us? Do we really treat them exactly the same as somebody that will be a closer match to us? That is much, much harder to turn around. There's also a cumulative effect. Even though there's only a trace element of that implicit association or unconscious bias remaining in our behavior, even our non-verbal, very instinctive body language type of behavior, even if it's only 1 to 2%. Remember, of course, that world champion tennis players like Roger Federer become one of the greatest tennis players of all time by winning only 54% of their games. You only need a marginal increase above the average for it to have a very, very powerful effect. And that's what happens across a culture. And before you know, unless you work really, really hard against it, you develop a culture where it actually begins to significantly influence behavior. So how does this play out in academia? A couple of examples. Some of it is a drip effect of the people feeling less welcome if they're on the receiving end of this kind of thing. This was truly brought home to me about 20 years ago at my former institute, the Bagram Institute, when one of the female PIs pointed out to me that PI interviews were carried out in a room by a committee that was almost all male, apart from the female HR manager. That has improved, by the way. There is now an obligation to have a mixed recruitment panel unless you can justify any reason why it is not. And similarly, conferences are almost always have an obligation to have a mix, a good balance of gender and race and other characteristics among the speakers and among the chairs. So these are big developments to the positive, although it still has a long way to go. So she told me that this interview takes place with an almost completely male committee in a room which around the size of that room had the paintings of every former institute director, all of whom were male. And this had a very, very powerful unconscious message to her of, you don't belong here. Now, we can work against that. Of course, we can with a bit of effort, we can overcome that. But that's an extra sort of burden on that person while they're going through the interview that when I went through it, didn't have. And I totally acknowledge that is a big thing. And that's one of the reasons why it matters so much to have a more representative panel. And I think they've done away with the paint. Well, they've moved the paintings. Another area that I think Daniel will expand on in a moment about how it also affects our science. The one I was going to bring up is reviewing papers. So I have definitely been on the receiving end of, we've all been on the receiving end of reviews we feel are unfair. I've been on the receiving end of such things from US journals. And I've actually found myself on some occasions complaining to the editor that there's an unlevel playing field with US scientists. I think I'm actually right about that. But I don't think on balance, but I don't think my approach to that really will have helped, because I would only put them on the defensive. But I do think it's a fact. Only for the following week to have a paper that I was asked to review from a country that's less primarily associated with, doesn't have such a long history of high level science as the UK. And I don't know how many people out there would do this, but I have been in the habit, I have to say, of one of the first things I look at, which country does it come from? And I had to check myself on this occasion, think, why? Why does that matter? I have certainly had many extremely good scientists come to my lab from all kinds of countries. This, just because somebody's working in any particular country does not mean they or their group are not capable of very high first-class science, and we have to work against that. That's a very natural thing we may sometimes tend to, and that's another area we've got to work on. So we'd all wish it wasn't there. But I think that's like wishing that we'd evolved wings. It is the way we are. What we call unconscious bias today are features that once kept our ancestors alive, and that's why we are here. But in modern society, it is extremely unhelpful. So key messages: no judgment, recognize that we all have it, and the more open we can be about that, the better we can all deal with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was really well put. I loved your approach of taking it from that kind of early stages as we progress through through life. In collaborative research environments, how can, which of course you highlighted that you're involved in yourself, how can unconscious bias influence the dynamics between different disciplines, and what measures do you think we can take to foster more productive collaborations? And I pick up on this because I'm kind of very conscious of things like, you know, in clinical work, the kind of link between neurologists and psychiatrists and things, of which we, you know, that never the twain shall meet on some things. And I don't think that's necessarily unconscious. I think, although it might be. Yeah. But how do you think we can address some of those things?
I think a healthy respect for other disciplines. But I completely get where you're coming from. I mean, this clearly doesn't have its roots, you know, like in childhood, because these are issues that we only come into in much later in life, about the finesse of different disciplines within research. But I totally agree that there does tend to be a culture of, you know, one camp and a different camp. Non-clinicians like myself and clinicians, and the danger of a view developing of, oh, you're only a medic, or that person's a non-clinician, they don't know anything about patients, and that's not going to get anyone anywhere. If we're going to make progress in research, we have to reach across those boundaries and recognize the value of doing that, and the synergistic outcomes that can come from that. Yeah, a respect for the other side, I think.
You've got to have that. I mean, you can see how clearly training is something that could be delivered more, just to make people aware, because, I mean, it's in the name, isn't it? It's something you do unconsciously, so you need to become conscious of it to address it, because if it's unconscious, you know, it's not that you're doing anything wrong necessarily, you just don't know it exists until it's brought to your attention. And so, as you say, talking about it more to bring people's attention to these biases where they exist are important things to do. As somebody who leads a diverse international team, what practices are essential, do you think, for minimizing unconscious bias in research settings?
I think a little bit of understanding of the different people's background. Nobody wants to know or give away everything about their life to their colleagues, but a little bit of understanding of where they come from, some of the hurdles they've probably dealt with to get where they are, and also a recognition of how, especially with people who are possibly not from this country or don't fit the majority demographic in whichever way, a recognition by everyone of the extra challenges that brings, and a respect for it, really, to recognize that none of us are, you know, there's no Mr. Average or Miss Doctor Professor Average or whatever. we're all unique in so many ways, and I think it's important to respect that.
I think the test, the kind of test you gave everybody at the start, the quiz to say who would you have accompany with you, you kind of almost want a big long list of examples like that to test, that you give to people, and then to use that as a tool to go back to challenge those thought processes that went into informing that. It almost feels like this is the kind of thing that therapy would psychotherapy would help us uncover some of these things. We have a question from Gareth Elliott who asked, I was wondering if there are any exercises we can do to overcome implicit associations. Have you come across any, Michael? Or Daniel, do jump in if you have. I'm going to come to you next.
Yeah, I haven't come across exercises specifically about that, but I would flag up one of the links I put in the chat to the book A Path Through the Jungle from Professor Steve Peters. So Steve Peters was also the author of the Chimp Paradox back in the day, extremely famous book. What he, like a number of other psychologists, right back to Freud and Kahneman and even back to Plato, to be honest, have recognized the unconscious part of our brain, the emotional part of the brain, and the rational part of our brain. That is a really, really important fact. But he actually also talks about another part of our brain that he calls a computer, which you can really describe as automatic habits and beliefs. But like any habit, or like any learning process, like learning a musical instrument or learning to drive a car, this can be learned through a lot of practice, and you have to put up with a lot of mistakes along the way. You're not always going to get it right, but you can gradually improve. And this applies to any aspect of how we manage our emotions and our unconscious mind. But the kind of processes he describes in there, I think, are suited for this. So it really is a matter of reviewing at the end of each day, or as often as you can, what did I do today? Did I handle that in quite the way I really truly would want to, or did my emotions take over, or my unconscious mind take over, and was I doing it in a way that actually I don't really value? I don't really want to be that person. I want to be this person. And it's by going through that and maybe anticipating the next day a little bit and thinking, what may be coming? How will I behave when I'm going through that? And it's repeating that process over and over and over again. Eventually, you start to behave more like the person you would like to be, more like acting with your values, which is treating people equally rather than being controlled by your unconscious mind. However, it's probably true to say we'll never overcome it completely. And you have to go easy on yourself a little bit when those mistakes happen. There will also be, even no matter how practiced we are, there will always be days when we're tired or stressed. And then it's harder.
And top tips for parents, of course, because as you said, I mean, all these starts in where you grow up in childhood, how you see the people around you behaving as well, and the things they say and they do. That kind of group think that I guess influences how you then behave in other situations. And so you can start to influence others around you by calling out, I guess, bias when you come across it.
Yeah. Although I would stress not in a judgmental way, because I think is counterproductive, but just in a calm moment, perhaps pointing it out as just fact or
I mean, the point you make, I guess that you made at one point during your talk about the panels or manels as they became, very, very called out. I mean, that's something that's been getting called out for a few years now, and I think has finally started. Most events have started to do away with that. And
I think US conferences today, they won't get NIH funding if they do not have for the conference, if they do not have a good balance in their speakers and chairs.
And that isn't to say that the organizers went out of their way to organize kind of, white, middle, older male panels. It just happened. And then, but I think most of the time when people have highlighted and said, hey, did you realize this? There has been some embarrassment and gone, oh, actually, you're right.
yeah,
we should address that.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm going to Daniel been very patient, and I should also answer that if any of you, of course, have any answers to these questions, don't just rely on us and our experts. So if anybody has a question, post it in the chat, and if somebody else has a good answer to that, do go in and reply yourself. We want to hear from you as well. So, but Daniel, thank you very much for waiting, and I'll hand over to you now.
Just before I start giving you my bit of thoughts, I just wanted to, it's not quite an exercise for overcoming implicit association, but to answer Garifali's question, I found it really interesting. I think it was this very same project from Masari Banerjee, and I think it's called Project Implicit, and there's like a link to do like the implicit association test. So it's very humbling, I would say, to take it as with an open mind, and it just makes you react very quickly to associate certain words with certain profiles of people, and then sort of gives you an idea of where your most salient, let's say, implicit bias come from. So that's a very interesting point to take into account. But yeah, then what Michael said still holds. Like, I don't think we can really get rid of it, but it's a good thing to acknowledge that. Yeah, thank you, Adam. So yeah, just before I start, also a bit of disclaimers here. I'm Spanish scientist. I'm mixed race and first generation scientist. I'm a cisgender gay man, and I'm a huge Taylor Swift fan. And I think all of those things impact the way I do science and inhabit this world. So everything that I would say today or any other day we chat about will probably be influenced by all these things. Just also to make you aware of that, my relationship with the concept of unconscious bias does not really come from a more academic setting. It actually started more on the field of activism. So as Adam, mentioned before, I participate on a Spanish association for LGBTQI plus scientists, and we sort of discussed this kind of matters. And I started to become more and more conscious of the fact that like there are bias that we import in our lives and the way we judge people, or not even judge, but just like the assumptions we make about people, right? And these kind of implicit associations we make about them. And then I just started thinking that all those things can also be used in the way we, as people, carry ourselves in the scientific field, because most of the things we do are interactive with other people. Like science does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in a specific social context, and it takes into account all of those social context situations, including the funding of specific groups or specific countries, or how much access to certain type of equipment that we have, and these kind of things. So it was more of activism to science approach instead of a more academic hardcore approach, which I also think has really influenced the way I approached the impact of implicit associations in my science and on my day-to-day life. So I will start a bit on by the end with the take-home message. So if there's only one thing to take home from whatever I say today, is this: just let's consider that science is not objective. So, well, if we want to be like a bit more strict, we could say science is only as objective as the people doing it. And I don't think no one would ever think of other people, including ourselves, right, as objective per se, right? Like we can try to objectivize our opinions or objectivize the way we see the world, but really objectiveness is not a human trait at all. In that sense, a lot of the things Michael mentioned already are how we as people are making these implicit associations daily, constantly. But I want to touch specifically on how that can affect the way we do science. And I think this is very clear in some other bits of science that are not strictly related with the kind of research this community does. So maybe if we take into account more like social science or anthropology, history, this kind of fields that do have bits of science or areas of science that are devoted to that, they are really taking into account all these kind of things, and they have huge sections of how the identity of the researcher actually can influence the way the results are taken. And it's true that it's maybe less obvious when you take it to other bits of science, to more like classical STEM fields of research, but it's still there nonetheless. So it's still more clear when we talk about STEM in terms of people or directly related to people. So, for instance, if we think about healthcare, one of the classical examples is how different diseases or different pathologies have a specific science in males and females, and how that has led to underdiagnosis on females for certain things like heart attacks, and how they manifest, or how the females are more usually diagnosed with mental health issues instead of their male counterparts, this kind of thing. One of the classical examples that also comes to mind when I think about these kind of things, it was a paper that came out from PNAS, where they demonstrated, and I do a huge quotation mark for this, but they demonstrated that bisexual men exist. And I even got a quote from this paper because I wanted to phrase this exactly as they said. And one of the questions they had from the paper was whether men are substantially sexually aroused and attracted to both sexes. And they made the claim that that was a controversial thing. So despite of having I don't know, centuries of evidence of people self-declaring, of men self-declaring themselves as bisexual, they just came and with all this implicit association, right? All this unconscious bias of like, I don't think we should take that into account. Decided to research that on a very genital-centric way, and that comes from a background of not being of making this kind of implicit associations about what or how people would lie or express themselves about desire or this kind of thing. And I always find it really reassuring for everyone to that says that we are doing way better, and it is true that we are doing way better. But this was published in 2020, so it's not really long time ago. On other fields, however, that we, for instance, I deal more with preclinical side of research, of biomedical research. So on those kind of fields, it's a bit more difficult to spot unconscious bias. I think, again, the kind of evidence that is usually spoken about is the use of or the less frequent use of female animals in preclinical research. And I also found very interesting that just 2 days ago, the first large-scale X chromosome wide association study was published on JAMA study, associating X chromosome with Alzheimer's disease. So again, that brings forward how very specific, non-directly related to people kinds of research can also be biased in that sense. One of the other things we as humans, but also specifically as scientists, do a lot is we have our own hypothesis, right? In the case of scientific endeavor, it's a needed step before we start actually doing the research, right? But one of the things that can lead us to implicit associations within this hypothesis generation steps is confirmation bias. We all tend to look for that, and in a lot of, well, there's some controversy there, but for a lot of authors, confirmation bias would be one way of implicit association or one way of unconscious bias in that sense. And that's why things like blinding or a good experimental design are fundamental when we talk about science, whether it deals or it doesn't with people in this case. But yeah. And the other very salient thing that comes to mind when we think about this in a more preclinical setting or a more objective field, as people would say, is the effect of the group thing. So if we think about the scientific community as some sort of hive mind, the assumption of like this has been previously reported and this has previously not been reported has a huge impact on the way we do our science and the way we interpret our results. So even when our results are contradicting previous evidence, we are still not convinced, or we should like double test them to be sure that this is actually what we got. So it's more of a thing of you should actually be able to do a good experimental design and then trust your results. And of course, it's always good to check and discussing how that fits into the literature. But I would argue that that kind of groupthink of assuming the scientific community is like an untouchable source of knowledge is also a source for this kind of implicit association towards the science or the results. And in this sense, other fields like physics or maths or chemistry, I have heard scientists from those kind of fields argue that implicit association or unconscious bias cannot be a part of these kind of fields. And if we think things as what I have just been discussing, like the hypothesis generation or the groupthink, those are very, very, very much present on these fields, but also all the things Michael was suggesting, for instance, like the review part, the peer review, that's also existing in these kind of fields. And yeah, whether you get to review a paper from people from certain nationalities that are not immediately associated with high level science, or whether you read something or attend a conference where someone presents results and they come from a background or like a country with less funding, this kind of thing can also impact how we understand science. So in this sense, unconscious bias does not only affect the way we do science, but also the way we interpret other people's science. In this other sense too, I think one of the strongest effects I have noticed in both myself and in others is the level of trustworthiness that we apply to certain people, like for instance, like conferences or any kind of meeting. And it's often the case that trustworthiness of a lot of groups of people is diminished. So, like, think younger people are usually credited less for their work or for their words. People who, I don't know, whose native language is not English, or people who speak with certain accents, even though their native language is English, are also considered less trustworthy, or like their science is considered like not maybe of less value, but maybe less merited. This has classically happened with women and with queer people or any gender non-conforming, especially if they are like visibly gender non-conforming, or people that don't adhere to standard social-cultural kind of canons. Even with people that are perceived as being non-pretty by these kind of standards. All of these things have consistently been shown to affect the way their words or the way their science is created. So I think it all takes us to the concept of professionalism and how that is fallacy in the end. That only tells you that a specific profile of person or specific profile of scientist is actually valid in that sense. Just before I finish, I want to also bring one last bit of just one comment of something that has been shown to me once and again, and I think it's important to also consider that there's an influence of our culture in how we have and how we process this kind of bias. So I would say there's like a more, call it primordial, primitive kind of effect of this culture, the whole friend versus foe thing, that has led to what we now call stereotypes, I guess, and how different cultures have different stereotypes, because historically we have differences on what we call a friend and what we call a foe. But also I think culturally we talk and we think about bias itself in a very different way depending on the cultures. And I'm saying this as a person with, yeah, again, mixed race origins, but also someone who is now living abroad in a different culture again. And I have noticed in my own experience, again, in conversation with other internationally people, that the way we talk about this, the way we talk about bias, or how explicitly we talk about bias or acknowledge our own biases, and how often do we have these kind of conversations that we are having here today, is really, really different depending on that background. So I think that's also something we should consider, and really, really brings out and highlights the importance of intersectionality when we approach these kind of things. That being said, I don't want to finish without touching a bit on what we can do, which also I think links very nicely with the question Natalia was asking before. So in short, I would say not a lot about having those unconscious bias, but we can do a lot with how do we deal with them. So I would say the most important thing is acknowledge them. Again, as Michael was saying, without any judgment, without any shame, because it's just part of how we have evolved to be who we are today. Um, Talk about it. So that's how events like this really, really help. And if we have this mindset of acknowledging and talking about it, and like be explicit about it, then we can keep challenging ourselves. And when we see, again, like younger people at the conference or people coming from a specific region that is not associated with high level science, then we would be able to catch ourselves on our first thought and say, oh, wait, actually, and proceed with that. Then on the more science bit of it, on the strictly scientific bit of it, the importance of good experimental design with appropriate blinding processes, and the very, very important role of reproducibility to make sure that the things are as objectivable as possible. So things are never going to be objective, but we can take measures to make them somewhat more objective, or at least comparable to extent where the evidence of comparability is enough to overcome that subjectivity. And then just consider the diversity and inclusion perspective always. So have a gender framework for like any kind of work. Again, like using female animals or pairing your number of males and females and taking into account that as a covariate in your analysis. Um, or even, yes, just like not really consider the author's names or the author's origins when you review papers, this kind of thing, which I think works a lot better in other fields of science where the double-blind reviews are a given, which has not usually happened, at least in my experience as a reviewer in biomedicine. So that would be me for today. Just to remind you of my take-home message. Just please be aware that we are here all trying to be objective, but science is only as objective as we make it, and that you should definitely be kind to yourself, but acknowledge that at the end of the day, we all have this kind of bias. We all do implicit associations, and that intersectionality is key, no matter how often we repeat this or how often do we have these conversations. Those things that overlap with other layers of our identity are really always relevant. So I hope all of that was clear and that you guys take something from this today. But if not, we can always chat about Taylor Swift's latest album.
Thank you, Daniel. That was really good. Thank you. And again, lots of food for thought in there. I mean, a couple of things that came to mind were making me think that young people are better at this than I mean, I'm old. I'm and I've got 50 years of baggage that come with that have added to my. But I do feel that I mean, I have a daughter who's 16 years old, and I feel that she is far better at identifying bias where it exists, or not having the same biases that I perhaps culturally have had growing up in the north of England, and there's older white man, as you've said before. So whether this is something that's going to get better in the future automatically, just because we're making a generation of young people where this is talked about more, we are more aware of bias and these where it exists, and better at calling it out, and even acknowledge that this exists now. I don't feel like it, even a decade ago, or maybe 20 years ago, that we would have even been having this conversation here today in quite the same way. Certainly not when it comes to day-to-day practices in science. We would have been having conversations about sexism and racism and homophobia and other forms of prejudice, but not implicit in this way. I don't know if you agree, both of you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it takes like a next step. So once we cover the basics of like we are all human beings, right? Then you can start looking inwards and see like how this affects my activities or like human activities in general. And science is just one of that. I do think it is improving and it is probably getting more talked about, and that's why younger generations are able to spot this way faster than we are, and really be, I would say, way more humble than probably our generations and the ones before me as well. But then again, I would say it's an implicit association to say younger people are automatically better at this. Because it does happen.
Of course, to say, oh, well, I've got an excuse. That it's not.
Yeah, no. Of course, but that's just to say that implicit association doesn't always have to be a bad thing. Like, it's not always just something judgmental about the other people. The halo effect is a way of unconscious bias or of implicit association, and that will be a positive thing for the person you're having those thoughts about.
Well, and I mean, the thing that's slightly, I think I'm going to go away and think more about is how much is really unconscious and how much is conscious, or how much you're willing to admit that I have certain prejudices. Like, if somebody sits next to me and get their Android phone out, I'm going to judge them because they've not got an Apple. No, I wouldn't really. That's a great example. But but I'm aware of that. I don't know, but maybe it's getting better at understanding when you have those biases without and going, oh yeah, I would judge people based on this, or I'm going to, when I write an article, because the question I was going to ask you was, because you do science communications, is how you think unconscious bias influences how we communicate research to the public, particularly. With co-production and patient and public involvement. In fact, I see one of our audience members this evening I know is involved in co-production, but it's taken people living with dementia having to shout and say, hey, you're not thinking of me when you're publishing your research, or you're not thinking of me when you're designing these studies. Care homes saying you're designing studies that we don't want to be involved in. To press upon researchers to change what they do. I don't. Do you come across examples of that, both of you, in your work, where you've had pushback that's made you recognise that bias exists?
In my case, linking it to the science communication question you just asked, I just had that very same thing this year. So I've just started. I just moved to the UK last year, so I started doing some engagement activities, like public engagement activities here to improve science communication in English as well. And one of the bits we did was just go into primary schools to just like deliver some science, trying to increase science capital in more science-deprived areas in Edinburgh, where I work. And my unconscious bias, my implicit association was like, these are children. They don't really know anything about what I'm going to be talking about today. And you'd be surprised. Every day I was there, I was consistently surprised by the extent of their knowledge and how good they are at putting it out. So I love to say I stand it corrected all the time, and I think that happens a lot in science communication, especially when we try and do this kind of more focus groups. In this context, for instance, of people working with dementia patients, I think it's really, really important to hear what patients have to say about that. Because at the end of the day, if I'm producing output that is not interesting or is not beneficial to the end user, let's say, then what's the point of research itself?
Yeah, I'd make exactly the same comment about some adult patient groups. I've certainly had the experience of doing a lay presentation to University of the Third Age group. Okay, so that's not patients, but it's adults, it's elderly adults, some of whom will be patients of various disorders. And someone coming up to me afterwards, when I feel I've sort of pitched my talk at the right level, probably is at the right level for a wide range of people, but somebody come up to that talk afterwards and ask an extraordinary perceptive scientific question. And there's a tendency to think, okay, you know, we're talking people, we've got to simplify everything. And yeah, there can be some very, very smart people out there.
Yeah. And again, it's having that information, isn't it, to make that judgment, like, you know, whether that's walking down the street at night and whether you cross the road when if you see one person of one kind, but you wouldn't if it was a woman walking towards you, you'd stay on your, you know, you keep going. It's interesting. We could talk about this forever, but I'm conscious I do want to at least jump into the chat for a few minutes to give our audience a chance to share their views. So thank you very much, Michael and Daniel. It's been wonderful, and I've really enjoyed this, and I've gone away with a lot to think about. But I think the takeaway message for me was keep an open mind at all times. Try to identify that bias when you do it. Do some of these training, do some of these tests, and whether it's communicating science, designing your studies, or you know, keep an open mind and challenge yourself to be better, and go away and educate yourself on where that bias might exist to do better at. So we can all be better, because everybody will benefit, whether that's your science or you as a person. As well. Thank you very much, Daniel and Michael, and we'll see you all in the chat now. Stay where you are, click on that button on the bottom right hand corner, we'll see you in there. Thank you.
Thank you.